Welcome. Thank you guys all for coming. My name is Ashley Andrews, and I'm part of the group Upper Valley Young Liberals that is hosting this. So I just wanted to say a little bit what Upper Valley Young Liberals is in case some of you here don't know. We are a group founded about 4 months ago by Nick Clark and a bunch of ex-Bernie Sanders campaigners and people working in the West Lebanon office for Bernie, like Allie Hannigan, our vice chair, who's now working for Matt Dunn. And the mission of our organization is to foster and encourage cultural and political participation from young people. Our group is not exclusive to young people, but we do try to push people under 35 to hold executive positions, try to get them into leadership roles that they might not otherwise be able to experience. And we've done a lot in the past 4 months. We've had people elected as national delegates, including myself. We have people running for office. We have people getting involved on the municipal level. So it's been really successful, and part of our model is that we have committees that branch off, and each committee, anything can be made into a committee if there's a member who has the desire or passion about a specific topic to do it. And Olivia LaPierre over here is extremely passionate about the environment and sustainability, and she came to us and started coming to meetings and said she was interested in doing a sustainability committee, which she has headed. And today, this is the committee's first event. So next we have with us Connor Kennedy, who has recently been working for John Campbell, the Windsor Senator, and now he is running for the seat because John is stepping down, he's not gonna run again. So Connor Kennedy is running for Windsor State Senate, and he is gonna talk to us about sustainable communities.
Hi everybody. Like Ashley said, my name is Connor Kennedy. I'm from Heartland, Vermont. I grew up on a small farm there. So when I initially think of sustainability, I think of farming. I'm a farm kid, so you think of everything you can use on a farm, how to reuse it, and use it in the most efficient way possible. Anyone else, when you think of sustainability, what comes to mind, just off the top of your head? Anybody?
Solar panels.
Solar panels, perfect.
Soil.
Soil. Recycling is another one. Food waste, trees. So for the last 3 years I worked in Senator Campbell's office, and it was a great job. I loved it. You get to see the ins and outs of government, and most importantly, I got to work with people across the state. And as you've known, it's in all sorts of articles, is we are not a growing population in Vermont. We have young people that are leaving. We have older people that can't afford to stay here, and they are leaving. And so one of the ideas that I've had time to think about and talk to great people, you'll hear from Senator Zuckerman too, and he's well aware of these issues as well, is how do you keep people here? How do you foster an environment where people want to stay, where they want to raise their kids or start a business and actually enjoy the quality of life that we have here in Vermont? And in my mind, it comes down to the local level of communities that we have here. White River Junction, I think, is a perfect example. You come to White River, you can park your car, and you can do a bunch of different things. You can walk around, you can go to a coffee shop, or you can go to a store, you can come to the Briggs. It's perfect, but not all communities are like that. One of the issues that I've found time and time again is communication. It's 2016, so we got Facebook, we have Twitter, texting, emails, we have all this access to communication, but it's not always utilized. And so as you've heard from people here tonight, there's all these great organizations across Windsor County, across the state that are doing wonderful things. And the question is, how do we get those organizations to work more closely together so we have more robust communities? Now the idea is something, and I like to use the Copenhagen method. When they design their city, or any new addition to their city, they bring different groups of people involved. So what is a family with a child that's 5 years old and 12 years old gonna do when they need to go to the city? Let's say the mom wants to go shopping, the husband wants to go look at a new bike, and the kids want to play in the park. So they bring all those different individuals. They bring kids in to look at how they want to play in their cities. They bring seniors in, how do they want to play in their cities. So you have a park nearby with swing sets, you have a skate park that's right there, and clothing shops. It draws people in, it creates better relationships within a community, and you're able to grow and foster a healthy environment where people want to stay, where they want to be. And that's what I think we need to do for the state of Vermont. And that's what people are looking for. We have to connect communities. And the question is, how do we do it? One of the biggest thing that we have to figure out is transportation. Vermont's tricky. You have to drive in a lot of places. We have some buses, the current's great, it can get you from town to town. We have to have better organization so that you can time your day so you have access to taking the bus in the morning. We have great park and rides, but they're scattered, and there has to be more information there. So let's say you want to do something after work in a different community, you could park your car, you drive a parking ride, you park your car, and then you're able to go about your day and come back. In that journey alone, you're meeting with people on the bus, building relationships, getting to a city center or a town center, and building relationships there. You need to have a relationship with the environment in which you're in, and that's how you build more sustainable communities. People want to feel a connection with where they are. And I think in my experience from talking with people, especially younger people, is they feel isolated. So you have different groups, maybe you have your Facebook friends, but if you're 15 years old, it's difficult to be able to go to your friend's house. Unless your parents can drive you, maybe they're close enough if you're lucky that you can ride your bike or walk. But if you don't have access to that, of course you're gonna have this sort of built-in, you're gonna grow up feeling that isolation. And that's why people wanna leave. It's not because they don't like Vermont or New Hampshire, it's because they want to explore, they want to see new things, and they don't feel like it's possible to meet people, to grow up, to experience a diverse quality of life. So how do we get there? The biggest thing is getting, again, all groups of people involved. We have these pieces, it's all over the place. But we have to get everyone involved to figure out what we want to do. So you create a goal, you figure out what the best way to go forward is, and again, everyone needs to be involved. So right now, let's say we have White River and Springfield partnered together. What do we want to do? We want to get people like yourselves involved so that when we're talking, and depending where you're from, we know what our different goals are for Springfield. Maybe it's, we want to have a better bus system, a more frequent bus system that goes to Springfield. And then Springfield's saying, well, if White River has, they have the thrift stores and they have got the Tucker box, what can we bring? It's building unique community systems that are connected in a way, but also that give a unique perspective that grab people's attention and want to bring them there. Green spaces are huge. When you can go somewhere, relax in a park, it attracts people again so that you have a mixed, diverse community all interacting with one another. I think at this time, and you see it nationally with the political scene, which is still very crazy with one candidate that we have running for president, is people become disheartened and then they decide to pull back rather than getting involved. We have a group here, and I see some of you, the Upper Valley Young Liberals, they did the opposite. They decided to get together and figure out how we can go forward, getting more people communicating together. And then if that continues, imagine they started, I think it was in October or it was earlier this fall, and they've continued to build and build and build. If we bring these different groups together, we have a wonderful opportunity to make better places for people to live. So in the end, when I think about sustainable communities, it's about where people want to be, where you actually feel a connection with, not where you're driving through or where you're going, parking your car, or running out of your job to get back in your car and go home. It's places that you're attracted to, where you want to see people, where you walk down the street and you recognize that person, you have a connection to it. It has to be healthy environments, and you can do that. But we have to focus, and everyone has to do it together. I think at this point, there's a lot of energy that can be utilized to get to a better place. But we just have to figure out how people want to do it. There's a lot of wonderful people coming here on a sunny day. You could be outside, but you want to listen to all these different groups. It's wonderful, and that's a start. But there's a lot of work to do, and I think we have a wonderful opportunity to move forward. I know we're on a time limit, but I'm happy to take any quick questions or any thoughts on what you see as better communities or just general ideas or questions. Cool. Well, thank you for having me, everybody, and enjoy your day.
Awesome, thank you, Connor. He is part of the movement of young people who are really stepping up to the plate and taking responsibility in our democracy. So I'm glad he can make it. Next, we have David Zuckerman, who is my favorite candidate for Lieutenant Governor. He is currently serving in the Senate, and he is also an organic farmer. He came here today after the farmer's market up towards Burlington Way, and it's an honor to have him. He's going to speak about his views on sustainability.
Hello, and thank you, Ashley, and the Upper Valley Young Liberals. I appreciate your inviting me down to speak. To me, sustainability first rests on a global scale with each of us and our individual choices. Because frankly, we can each want other people to do things a certain way, or use less energy, or take public transportation, or eat food that's grown more sustainably, or use reusable mugs as opposed to plastic cups. We can want lots of change for others and by others, but ultimately it takes the change within ourselves to start down that path. And I often, when I'm talking with folks about change or sustainability, I sit there and say, we can also be overwhelmed and say, wow, for the world to proceed in a sustainable way, we each have to change such a huge number of things in our lives that it's sort of overwhelming and impossible. And so I think it's also important not only to look at oneself and what one can change, but also look at the scale and pace at which you're going to make those changes. Because if you try to change everything all at once, it sort of becomes overwhelming and can be depressing, because in all likelihood, you may well, quote, fail at making all the change that you want. And so I think it's really important, as one reflects on the individual change you can make, both for yourself and then slowly trying to influence others, that we are all imperfect beings. And if we try to become perfection, we actually will be overwhelmed, depressed, and we'll drop out of that and just go right back into our screens, where we can absorb our mind in other things and not think about it. Now, within the political process, it's really interesting, because politically, in Montpelier, everything is on a 2-year cycle. So we have 2-year governor, lieutenant governor, Senate, House. Everything is a 2-year cycle. So as you as individuals engage in that process, occasionally calling on a piece of legislation, a legislator about a piece of legislation, or voting every couple of years in that level, or every couple of years for your local city councilors, if you expect all the change to be made in 1 2-year cycle and the world to be perfect afterwards, A, you're going to be depressed again. But B, you are expecting too much, because your politically elected folks think on 2-year horizons. You think about how unsustainable our society's sort of economic and political footprint is. Remember that, in fact, we are trained to not be thinking sustainably. We're thinking, how do I do something so that in 2 years I'll get reelected? Now, I don't know about you all, but I think the planet's been around a lot longer than 2-year cycles. Trees, 2 years, a tree is this big. And so if we think that in 2-year cycles we're going to be able to pass legislation, or in particular, pass legislation that thinks long term. Because what we have to do in the political world often is pass legislation that has an immediate impact on people. Otherwise, you don't feel like we're doing anything. So partly it's thinking about the stories that come out of the media and how they're telling you this is going to happen right away, or that's going to happen right away, or this change is going to make this effect. When really, sometimes it's important to be saying, maybe passing legislation doesn't have an immediate effect, but has a long-term cumulative effect towards sustainability, is what you need to look for and push your political elected people to do. So for me, in the political, I have sort of 2 worlds. I live and work on my farm, 25 acres of organic vegetables, organic chickens, organic pigs. And there are times when what I'm doing doesn't seem like it's an economically or wise thing to do for the amount of energy it's taking me. But on the other hand, I think about the soil and how I'm trying to leave it in a better state for whoever farms it in 30, 50, or 75 years. And then if I just go at it to get an immediate result, yes, that may be better off in the short term, in that 2-year, sort of I'm reflecting on the 2-year political cycle, but it's really not better in the long term. And so looking at yields from the field over 25 years and what that average is versus what can I get out of it as an average over the next 2 years will make it so that I treat that soil differently. Well, politically, if we drive our political leaders with our comments, with our requests, and what we ask political leaders to do is to think about longer term situations, then they will start to think that way as opposed to the 2-year return. So I think about PFOA in Bennington. And now thankfully, we're starting to talk more about chemicals that we use in manufacturing or chemicals that are in our society on a day-to-day basis, whether it be perfumed soaps versus just soap, or other things to chemicals in manufacturing. We have to start thinking about what are the 25, 50, and 75-year impacts of saying, we need to allow this to happen for this immediate short-term goal. And then now we learn, down in Bennington, we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of work to do, where that short-term goal has now created this long-term cost. And so citizen engagement, to me, and community engagement is something that you have to be committed to for a very long time. I have a friend who drove down with me today who first started working with Bernie Sanders back in around 1972. I might have the years wrong by 1 or 2 years. I don't suspect in 1972, Bernie Sanders and Martha Abbott were thinking, Bernie, you're gonna be running for president someday. What you've been fighting for, what you're gonna fight for today is gonna be such a consistent message for 40 years that it's gonna resonate with people. But they just beat the drum and worked hard and kept pushing for that change. And granted, we're still fighting, there's still a shot, but while he may not become president, the change that has occurred because of the effort that folks like Martha and Bernie have put in for 40 years is transforming the dialogue in this country in a way that nobody ever thought. And so I think it's also important to think about when you're pushing for change in your community, to think long term, that the ultimate solution may come after your efforts are done. And it isn't necessarily about whether one gets credit for that, as it is how have you changed the dialogue or the community or the culture or your own house. And so to me, when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about our economy, when we talk about our community, it still all comes back to you as an individual and me as an individual and each of the other individuals in our state, of which we have great people across the state working together to push for change that, again, they may never see. I started bringing up genetic engineering in food back in 1999 in the legislature. I was one of the first legislators in the country to do that. And I pushed for legislation and kept talking with my colleagues, and grassroots folks all over the state worked to inform people more about what genetic engineering means in our food supply in terms of added chemical use of certain kinds, which chemicals in our food and sustainability, if you ask me, those words don't quite go together. That's how most of our food is created today. But I didn't know if anything major would ever happen. And when I left the legislature after 14 years, we hadn't passed major legislation. I was out for a couple of years. I returned in the Senate, and the ball had started rolling faster. I hope that my engagement with that process in the Senate helped get that ball over the finish line. But I suspect, had I not been elected, there probably had been enough momentum built over those 14 years by hundreds of Vermonters across the state, if not thousands, that some other political leaders were starting to introduce those bills, and that ball was rolling. I was lucky enough to return and still be there to do it. But when I started it, I had no idea if legislation on GMO labeling would pass before I was done. And so I think it's really important as we strive for change and we strive to think about 7 generations out, and we try to think about sustainability, that we realize it's really not about any one of us. It's about our broader community and where we're going to be in 50 or 100 years. When I was chair of agriculture, I served with a farmer who I had actually interned with before I was in politics or farming, Will Stevens. And he and I would talk about, and we actually had a couple of meetings in the committee about saying, where do we want farming in 50 years or 100 years? No one had ever asked that question in the 15 years prior, 10 years prior that I'd been in that committee or in that body. It was always, how do we deal with the problem immediately today? And we'd throw all this money at it and get through that hump, which we needed to do. But you think, what if we had all that money and invested in a way that would make it so farms could be economically sustainable for a longer period of time, so that 6 years later, we're not trying to find more money to save farms from this dip again. And so it's about how we think. And with the immediacy of media and Twitter and our phones and everything else, we get so wrapped up in the immediate moment right here that we sometimes can't see out there. So to me, sustainability is all those things. From a policy perspective, I'll throw out 1 or 2 ideas that I think are important for Vermont's future in terms of our economic and rural economic and cultural sustainability. And one is to revitalize our farming community. Ashley pointed out they came from the farmer's market. It wasn't quite over. I left early in order to get here, but I've got a couple crew that are carrying the mantle for me there. But if you look at the farmers markets and the growth over the last 10 years and what those mean for communities where people come together and socialize, being together with other people. We are animals and creatures that actually like generally to be with other people. Farmers markets are revitalizing that kind of community. Well, you don't have a farmers market if you don't have lots of small farms. So encouraging building more small farms again that would repopulate our rural communities where you'd have enough people that you could staff your volunteer fire squads that now can't be staffed because everyone leaves to go to work. You know, IBM up in Essex Junction, or Global Foundries, whatever it's called now, they have people that work there that live in every single county in the state. I don't happen to think that's particularly sustainable either for the planet with people driving so far, or even for those individuals who are driving 2 hours back and forth every day for work. How is that sustainable to one's soul and spirit when you're burning so many hours of your day in a car and not with your family or your community? So repopulating our rural communities with encouraging more small farms, but also with broadband. And I know a lot of people have talked about it, and we've never quite funded how to have broadband in our rural communities. But if we actually had broadband in rural communities, people could drive far less to work because they could work out of their homes. They could have 3 or 4 people that live within a mile or 2 who work for them that might bike to there or walk. And even in the winter, you can do that if you're only going a mile or so. But how do you get broadband? Well, you got to pay for it. Well, when you look at most of the major infrastructure in this country, whether it be our transportation infrastructure, our telecommunications infrastructure, our electrical infrastructure, those are all paid by the broad collective of everybody with your tax dollars building out that infrastructure, because capitalism doesn't pay for the last mile or 4 miles because there's just not enough economic payback. And so to me, we have to pay for it in our public dollars. But we don't have enough public dollars, so how do we change that? Well, I've been a lead sponsor on cannabis reform, and some people might say, well, that's a really bad thing. Well, cannabis is everywhere. It's completely unregulated. Young people have unfettered access from a drug dealer who doesn't care whether it's laced with anything, who doesn't care how old you are, doesn't check your ID, doesn't care if it's moldy or got pesticides on it or some other drug. So if we like the way it's working, great. Let's let young people continue to be exposed to drug dealers who might run out of pot and wanting to sell them something else. Or bring it into a regulated environment like alcohol, where it's actually harder for young people to get because you have to find a buyer to get it. Or at least if you do get it, you know whether it's 3.2, 4.7, 7.4, 13.1%. We would know that with cannabis. So now that I've dispelled the myth of young people are going to smoke more when 70% of young people have access today on that one, and that it might be better to have it in a regulated setting, what would the economic impact be? Well, you could have small, relatively small cannabis farms. A room this big could be about a $500,000 operation. Well, if we had $500,000 operations, 2 or 3 of those in every county or every town with 7 people working $15 to $20 an hour jobs, and you had people coming to Vermont to go skiing instead of New Hampshire or Maine and spending money on hotel rooms and lift tickets that otherwise might go to another state, and we added 100 or 2 or $400 million to our economic activity above the table as opposed to the 100 to 200 million that's below ground right now, you would have income taxes, you would have rooms and meals taxes, you would have gas taxes, and we would have the resources we need to build out our broadband infrastructure, which would then be the investment, taking one set of money and investing it in a way that would create another set of money. And so we need to start looking at things as investments rather than always looking at debt. So I'm going to circle back to the farm and then wrap up for questions, which is that when I think about farming, as I said earlier, I want to leave that soil healthier. But today, so much of our agriculture is about depleting our water aquifers, depleting the nutrients in our soil, and somehow annually adding them back in, which means mining somewhere else and trucking them and so forth and so on. We need to invest and build our soil. We need to invest and build our infrastructure, not deplete it. And if you think about the overall way that we think, which is if you want something, take out debt to get it. We need to start thinking about how, if we're going to have a sustainable future for the next 100 or 200 years, how to move from the debt model and depleting our capital, aka capitalism, how to take and use what we have to invest in our future so that instead of always having to pay off debt, we're actually always building capital for the future. And so to me, that's part of the big picture of sustainability and how do we think beyond ourselves while also looking at ourselves and making the individual changes we can make and we can help others see to slowly make in themselves as well. So that's my thoughts on sustainability, on the economy, and our future. And I really appreciate your taking the time to be here today for all the different speakers, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I was wondering what your perspectives are on industrial hemp right now, because we have legalized the growing of hemp. I think it's still federally banned. And I'm just wondering why Vermont, or what your take on why Vermont hasn't moved into that market. I mean, the Navy buys hemp rope from Canada and other countries, and Vermont could be,
Sure.
could be that economy.
So the question was about hemp and why Vermont doesn't move further into the hemp opportunity. I will say that I introduced, others had before me, but didn't pass during them, but they kept the topic on the table. They were gone. I kept introducing it, and we actually passed the hemp legislation. So in Vermont, you are legally allowed to grow hemp. The state will not prosecute you for it. It is still illegal under federal law. We have a registry so that our law enforcement drives by a field and goes, whoa, and they call the ag agency, and the ag agency said, nope, that's a 20-acre hemp field. It happens that no one would ever grow a 20-acre pot field. The plants actually look very different. We don't need to get into all the details. But the growers who are doing it primarily right now economically, the only viable way to do it is for seed to grind either into oils or meal for protein and hemp products. The fiber process is a much more elaborate and processing conundrum. And until we have literally thousands of acres being grown, there really isn't the economic mass of hemp to be processed into either rope, fibers, papers, etc. That day may well come. We're slightly ahead of the curve from some other states. The federal government did slightly change their laws to allow land-grant institutions to help with research and purchasing seeds. And we have a land-grant institution who has been dragging its feet but is slowly coming around in the University of Vermont. Heather Darby with Ag Extension is very excited about hemp, both from a phosphorus uptake along along streams on ag fields, but also how to be a value-added product for farmers. So some of that discussion actually is happening, is moving forward, and there's a pretty robust small group of people actively growing seed, saving it so they have more seed for the next year. And those first few years, when you have 8 times the seed from 10 seeds, well, that's 80, but 8 times that is, 640, and you keep going, but it's way more than 8 to 1. But after 3 to 5 years, you start finally having 50-pound bags of seed, and you can start doing acres. And the next year, you can do hundreds and hundreds of acres. And we're just getting to that tipping point where some of the farmers growing it are going to start having it for sale for others.
Thank you.
Yeah, gentleman in the back.
Yes, regarding GMOs, the opposition to GMO is a concept we all agree with, I'm sure. But what about the farm fields in Vermont that are being sprayed with Roundup and all over the state? How many of them are there, and how can we stop these pesticides from being used routinely in our environment?
So the question about Roundup, how many fields in our state are being grown with GMOs and used with Roundup, and how do we stop these pesticides, or in that case an herbicide, from being used? Well, the first thing is individual decision making. So a lot of folks, I produce organic food, and sometimes people go, wow, organic is really expensive. Well, there's 2 thoughts there. First of all, there's a lot of local non-organic food that people are so excited about the word local, they actually pay the same price as local organic food, which I'm not going to get into the challenges I have with that in terms of the cost of production relative to the environmental consequences and the profit margins they're making relative to those of us that are in organic farming. But making decisions with how you spend your dollars, besides your voting choices and your vocal choices, how you spend your dollars is the most influential way that folks can make change. Because no one's going to grow organic food or stop using GMOs if you're still buying GMO food. So one of the things about the labeling bill that we passed is now you're going to start being able to make that decision, at least from a GMO to a non-GMO perspective. I'll remind you that non-GMO food that isn't organic is full-on conventional food that's been grown with umpteen types of chemicals. And so when you actually, and you will be surprised to hear this from me, but the crops that are grown only using Roundup are actually doing far less damage to the soil than some of the conventional means that were used before GMO technology, because the chemicals are even harsher than Roundup is. But as someone who produces food, rotating crops to deal with, so there's sort of herbicides and pesticides. To avoid pests, if you change your crops every year and where they are in your fields, you can actually avoid most of the pest problems compared to 100 acres of corn, same 100 acres of corn, same 100 acres of corn. Well, if you're a bug that likes corn, well, you're gonna hang out right there because you got dinner coming every year. They're gonna plant you the same food. So so diversified ag is important, and organic ag would be important. But ultimately, you also asked how much is grown. And one of the few GMO laws that we passed while I was chair of agriculture in the House was reporting of how many GMO seeds are planted in Vermont relative to others. And in around 2002, 2003, it was in the handful of percentages, 3%, 5%, 8%. Now it's 95% to 100% of the corn and the soy and the alfalfa fields that you see are GMO. Unless it's a vegetable farm, it's got 3 acres or 7 acres, which is why our farms don't dent that 100%, because we're talking about 30,000 acres. If 500 aren't, then that's a pretty small percentage.
To add to that, can you tell me, say Roundup is less damaging than some of the previous conventional pesticides and herbicides, but how damaging is Roundup to our environment, and what residual content in the food that is grown with Roundup gets into, for example, the cattle that are eating GMO?
Right. So the question is how damaging is Roundup? And I'm not an absolute expert on each and every chemical, atrazine versus Roundup versus metallochlor and all these other things. Roundup is, where I would say Roundup is damaging is not so much directly in what's being eaten by the animals, because it's usually sprayed months before you harvest a crop. They're spraying Roundup on the cornfield sort of now and next week or next month or so, and then the crops grow and they're harvested in October. But Roundup in our waterways, if they spray it near water, it doesn't break down as quickly and can really impact aquatic life quite a bit. But also, one of the things that Roundup does, and if you there was a study done in Tennessee a couple of years ago, and a report out in a very conventional agricultural major publication. It said 120 million reasons to be wary of herbicide resistance. And what happens is if you rely on one tool too frequently and you use Roundup every year on the same field 2 or 3 times, well, eventually some weed in that field is going to have a genetic disposition that's going to make it resistant to Roundup. And that one weed is going to live. And it's going to procreate with the one other weed in that field that did, or pollinate. And all of a sudden you're going to have 500 seeds or 1,000 or 10,000 seeds the next year that are all resistant. It's like double recessive gene, red hair, for instance. But if only redheads survived, then all of a sudden we have all redheads. Well, the same thing is true in weeds, and I'm okay with redheads, nothing against redheads. But ultimately the diversity is lost. And what happens is that 120 million reasons was that in Tennessee alone, one single state, it was determined that the farmers were going to spend $120 million more on those more toxic chemicals that they used to use to kill those weeds, because they had developed weed resistant to red-rooted pigweed and lamb's quarters, which are weeds that we have up here, by the way. A single plant can produce 200,000 seeds. And so, again, to me, it's the long-term thinking. So the short-term impact of Roundup, if you're exposed to it a couple times in your diet, is probably not particularly consequential. But the long-term consequence of using it over and over again is the need to use more and more harsher chemicals and going back to those more harsh chemicals, which are more toxic to you and me and the animals. And to me, it's the whole system of food production relying on chemicals as a whole and not crop rotation, and our buying cheap food, which is, I could go on and on about sustainability from our health and how we have all of these diabetes issues from buying cheap food with empty calories that are full of sugar, to our overall physical health and how it's changed over 40 years. If you look back at pictures from 40 years ago, the rate of obesity, et cetera, was much less. So the costs of our food system being a cheap food system, of which GMOs are a huge driver of that, that's where we're completely unsustainable. But in terms of shifting it, the way we shift it is our individual choices. Where do you spend your dollars? Do you need a brand new shirt when I start getting a little bit of fraying? No, I can wear a shirt with a frayed collar or a frayed pant leg. And if I make those last a little longer, then I can spend a little more money on my food and eating both healthier food for myself, for my long term. So my selfish interest is to eat healthier food, but also my selfless interest is to eat that healthier food because of how it's grown and what it means for the soil or the water where it's produced. And those are individual choices that we can make day in and day out. Yeah.
It's kind of ties into a lot of what you've been saying, but with the whole different chemicals, different nitrogen, and all that stuff getting into our waterways, and then the whole Lake Champlain thing, I know there was just a bill, I believe it was passed just this year, that addressed all that. And I was just driving around the state a couple weekends ago. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, doesn't matter. And I drove by like 4 farms who were sickle bar mowing or brush hogging their riverbanks. And I was wondering how that bill kind of goes to address and what as a culture we can do further to kind of help discourage and educate some of those farmers that, yeah, you may lose 50 feet of hayfield, but it's in the short term, but it's better than the river eroding and you losing 300 feet of hayfield over the next 25 years, which I have seen happen to my uncle's hayfields.
So with respect to the water quality bill, I think it was Act 64, and it was 2 years ago, which your memory is very good. We passed a law that's going to greatly change buffer zones in terms of where you can spread manure, which runs into the water. We actually have incentives for farmers not to cut so close to the border and get paid to leave some of that land not tilled, but they can cut the grass. If you're mowing for grass and hay, as long as you're not turning the soil over and exposing the soil, it'll be a pretty good filter for runoff and the roots are still there, as long as you don't cut so short and then it doesn't rain that the grass actually dies. But when I look at our conventional farmers who are cutting that outer edge of every field, well, 2 things to think about. If you take an area and you say the outer band is the band you have to leave 30 or 40 feet, that's actually 30 or 40 feet there accumulates far more acreage than 30 or 40 feet closer to the center if you were to make a circle. I mean, that's just geography. And so you're asking farmers to take the largest percentage of their field out if they've got a big long stretch. And when farmers are struggling to pay their bills, they have to think short term because the debt collector is coming, the electrical bill is coming, the feed bill is coming, all these other bills are coming, the veterinarian bill. And so to me, we can do state incentives and laws that say you can't do this, but there comes a point where the law of saying you can't do it and the ability to farm under their method of farming, which is conventional commodity milk, don't jive and won't work. And so it continues to go back to both laws that we can make, but if we're going to make a law that pays farmers not to use that part, are you willing to pay more taxes to do it? Because if the state's going to pay someone not to do something, the money's got to come from somewhere. Now, I happen to believe in more progressive taxation, but that takes everybody who's not at the high end of the spectrum saying, oh yes, that's right, we should raise taxes on the wealthy rather than nickel and diming ordinary people in order to pay for that. The other way to pay for that is buying food that pays the farmer a fair wage. Because if a farmer was making a decent wage for their work on their acreage, they wouldn't be squeezing the rock for blood or going to the very edge of the field to get that last bit of profit. Because on their farm, if it's a $400,000 business and they profit $10,000 a year or $20,000 a year, that 10 or 20,000 is that last bit that they brought into production. And if that's not there, they're just paying their bills and not making any money. And so supporting your agricultural community by putting your dollars into what you value, as opposed to sometimes things that we think we need, but we maybe don't. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and we regularly talk about needs and wants. And I think as a culture, with the TV telling us all the time that we need all these things, we've really lost track of the ability to discern what is a need and what is a want. And when you can start to really discern that, you're gonna find you have a lot more opportunities to put your dollars and your time and your effort into what's really important. Yes?
I want to play devil's advocate here because it comes up time after time again when we're talking about sustainability, short-term versus long-term. And I can only speak from my perspective, but I'm a single mother of a 4-year-old.
Yep.
I'm working 2 full-time jobs. I'm taking care of my handicapped mother. She's getting cut after cut to her Social Security. I have medical bills coming out the wazoo. By the end of the month, after all the bills are paid, needs, not wants.
That's right.
Bought shoes in like 5 years.
Right.
I have like maybe $150 to $200 to sustain my family throughout the month.
That's right.
On food. And I can go to Hannaford's, which isn't necessarily organic or sustainable, and feed them. And I could cut different things. I'm sure there's always something that you can cut out, but really when I sit down and I look at my budget, I'm paying for everything that needs to be paid
Absolutely.
for. And I don't have the ability to buy organic, healthy food to feed my family by the end of the month on $150.
That's right. So you bring up a really important point, and I'll say when I first volunteered for Bernie in 1992, what I learned from Bernie then and have continued to carry with me to this day is that ultimately, if someone can meet their basic needs, then they're not going to buy recycled toilet paper versus regular toilet paper, or organic food versus 3 boxes of mac and cheese for $1 as opposed to $1 a box. So there's no doubt that economic injustice has to be dealt with before we'll truly have environmental and climate justice. I have no doubt about that. What is remarkable in this state is the number of people that do have the ability to make those choices who don't make them. So that's one part. Because if more people bought organic food, I happen to have a fairly successful organic farm. So at the farmer's market, when people that come up with the EBT cash, crop cash, or farm to family coupons or whatnot, well, those are in dollar increments, sometimes $3 increments, and sometimes what they bring up is $4.25. Well, if they're bringing out farm to family coupons, I'll say $3 is fine. And we can individually make those adjustments. If as a farm I'm doing well enough that I can give away, quote, give away, I don't consider giving it away, I can charge the appropriate price to what someone can afford. That might be, in the long run for my farm over the season, $350 less in income, but because everybody else is paying as they can and should for the work, then I in my own little way can do my redistribution the same way that I think as a society we should as a whole. And I think what you said also comes back to where I started with respect to we each make the change that we can. And we should never feel badly about the fact that we can't do everything right. If you are loving your children and providing for them in the best way you can, then you're doing everything right. And so it's a matter of looking at what one can do as an individual and where one can apply energy and or dollars to make something better. And if you're raising children that respect their community and their neighbors and all kinds of different people and think about, not dumping detergents or something out on the lawn, then they're already going to have a mindset that's more holistic than a lot of other children in our society. And so you're making a change in that way. And so the change isn't always the immediate thing. It's that investment in how we're thinking and what we're doing. So each of us can make a change in the way that most fits within what we're able to do. Absolutely. I think, okay, go ahead.
I don't know, for some reason I want to comment on that. It sounds like you're saying the changes we make are within the context of our lives, and there is no one answer that's gonna meet everyone's needs.
I think that's fair. I don't know if everybody heard that, but basically the change everyone makes is within the context of your life. And I think that's completely true, which is why sometimes as a policymaker, when I say, wealthy folks can afford to pay a little more, and they say, well, we'll just move to Florida or we'll just move somewhere else. And I'm actually willing to call that greed and selfishness. And not everyone who's running for office statewide is willing to say those kinds of words. But to me, that is what that is. It's not thinking about the bigger than oneself. I mean, if you die with $2 million or $10 million, what has that money really done? What could that money have done for either your or other people's happiness and long-term sustainability? So you have to do it within the context of where you are, but also think about how can you influence the policy world where those decisions are being made. Because for some reason, the 1% ends up winning in the political process, when in democracy, the 99% could be voting in people into office that could be making all kinds of changes. But that's not happening. And why not? Well, partly because of cynicism about the political process, but by being cynical and not participating, it's just giving in and allowing them to have even more power. So to me, more engagement, more involvement when one can. And sometimes it might just be voting because you're working 70 hours a week. And that's the case for the time being. And then maybe when the kids are 15 or 18, they can take care of themselves some more, and then you have more time to be involved. Who knows? But each of us has to look at the framework within the context we're in and realize we have lives that may be 60, 70, or 80 years long, and you're not going to make every change today, but you should start today. Because every day you're not doing something to make change for tomorrow is an opportunity missed. So, thank you for engaging in the conversation.
Great, thank you, David. And that was our last speaker, so thank you guys all for coming here. I think we all heard some really motivational things today, and although we didn't have a huge turnout, we got everything on film, thanks to the lovely Brianna Spangler, and I know she's gonna help us with some editing to put this online and to get it circulating so that next event, the message is out there, and I hope that everything that was said today resonates with you all and that you take it back to your community, and that next sustainability event, we're gonna have a full house, because this is the first, and Olivia did great, so just thank you, Olivia, and thank you guys all for being here. Have a great night. Take some snacks and drinks and stuff before you go. Help yourselves. Oh, wait, there's one other thing I was supposed to say. We have another event coming up. This one is going to be hosted by the Education Committee, and it's called What is Liberalism? And I think it's a really valuable talk. I'm personally excited for it because we all tag ourselves with these labels in today's political climate, but we don't always know the real true meaning or origin of those labels. So if you want to know more about liberalism, if you want to know more about terms that you hear all the time, progressive, socialist, things like that, come to What is Liberalism. It's going to be this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. at the Main Street Museum. And find Upper Valley Young Liberals on Facebook if you're not following us, and that event will be posted there as well. So 6:30 on Thursday, Main Street Museum.